This is The Conspiracy of Man, a video series about Jesus the man. Not Jesus the Christ or anointed Son of God of Christian myth, but Jesus the man who proclaimed himself the Son of Man. This is the story of who Jesus actually was and what he actually did. The Conspiracy of Man is a story about the Essene conspiracy to bring down the temple using Jesus to fulfill the laws of the blood sacrifice, ancient laws ostensibly established by Moses with Yahweh. By offering himself up as the final blood sacrifice of the Paschal lamb, Jesus brought the entire sacrificial system into question. The Priesthood. We begin this video with a description of the priesthood written by Benjamin D. Gordon from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. In the Second Temple period, Judean priests took an active role in the farming life in the countryside, far beyond the temple precinct in Jerusalem. Some priests were landholders themselves, hiring labor, trading their goods in the local markets, and acquiring new land through gifts or purchase. Some cultivated relationships with patrons who supported them, while others served in the role of patron to farmers in need, providing them with loans. The evidence for the active role that Judean priests played in the agrarian economy of Second Temple Judea fits broader patterns in the ancient Mediterranean. Cultic authorities regularly played an actual role in economy and exchange. Ancient religious organizations could directly manage production in the environment. Take, for example, the religious fairs and festivals of antiquity. These were major generators of commerce. Jerusalem in the 1st century CE offers as good an example as any. The enlargement of its sacred precinct by King Herod, beginning in 20 BCE, was meant to turn Jerusalem into an international attraction. And it succeeded. Its sacred precinct had a circumference of nearly 1 mile. The early Jewish historian Josephus probably exaggerates when he claims that 2,700,000 male pilgrims came to the city during the Passover of 66 CE. Nonetheless, he gives some sense of the magnitude of this Eastern pilgrimage city. Its economy was sustained largely by the 3 harvest festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Fairs and festivals aside, many temples of the ancient world were landowners themselves. The presence of temple land, usually framed as the land of a patron deity, could sacralize a landscape. The administration of temple land varied by region. In the Greek world, it was typically managed by city officers. In Babylonia and Egypt, it was leased by temples to the highest bidder, who then rented the plots out to tenants. In some cases, temple land was, in fact, held privately by individual priests and their families. The sprawling and fertile churchland of late antiquity carries on the phenomenon, as does, in a sense, the typical monastic farm. The polytheistic religious organizations predating the Christian era presided over what has been called the temple economy. This refers to the flow of goods and services through the sacred institution. There were, of course, construction and maintenance costs for the house of worship. There were costs of operating a regular cult of sacrifice, animals, oils, grains, appurtenances that needed to be procured. There were religious festivals and pilgrimages to sponsor. To cover these expenses, temples relied primarily on the largesse of their patrons and worshippers, entrance fees, and fines for violations. Those with sufficient cash capital could issue loans at interest. Those with land collected rent. Jewish scholars of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, that is, the earliest scientific approach to the study of Judaism in the 19th century, examined the late Second Temple period by careful study of the writings of the rabbinic sages of the 3rd century CE and onward. Those writings weave fabulous tales of the great sages of the 1st centuries BCE and CE, such as Hillel and Shammai. Very little is said in them, however, about the priests. Based on the rabbinocentric bias of the Jewish source material, Wissenschaft scholars argued that the priests in those centuries had become a detached class of plutocrats, mostly urban, given to corruption, and disengaged from the needs of the populace on the countryside. In this atmosphere, the theory goes, a democratizing rabbinic class was born, a meritocracy, as it were, and a most welcome replacement for the status-obsessed aristocracy of the Jewish priesthood. It is of some relevance, of course, that many Wissenschaft scholars were Jewish reformers themselves. A contemporary of theirs in German Protestant circles, Julius Wellhausen, who is known for articulating the documentary hypothesis for Torah formation, characterized the Torah's priestly source as reflecting a degenerate, overly ritualistic, spiritually disengaged form of religious expression. His suspicions of the Catholic Church, and perhaps disdain for observant Jewish practice, may have colored his view. Even today, there may be an anti-ritual bias in historical thinking about the Jewish priesthood. That the sacrificial cult is supervised was a primitive expression of religiosity, either a perversion of enlightened religion or a stage in the evolution of religion into a higher form. This higher form of religion, so the thinking goes, was marked not by the ritualized slaughter of animals, but by study, prayer, and philosophical thinking. As a result, modern scholarship has been prone to celebrate Israel's prophets and be fascinated with its kings and sages, but not with its priests. When scholars study ancient Judean priests in the temple, their focus tends to be on issues of center rather than periphery. The cult of sacrifice in Jerusalem has been a major point of inquiry, as have been the high priests. Entirely rare, however, are studies on the everyday lives of priests and their roles outside of the Holy City, where they lived, and how they managed divine property in the countryside. Jerusalem, in the mid-5th century BCE, the time of the Persian governor Nehemiah, offers an instructive example. During that period, the Holy City was limited to the narrow summit of its southeastern hill, with little more than 1,000 residents. The temple stood at its helm, but it was a far cry from the sanctuary destroyed by the Babylonians over a century prior. It was controlled by a line of Aaronide priests who redacted old national legends and legal codes into what came to be known as Torah. The latest legal code of Torah, which is called the Holiness Legislation, was probably authored by the same priestly guild, which was based both in Jerusalem and at the region's other sanctuary to God at Met Gerizim, the capital city of the province of Samaria. The holiness legislation is acutely interested in matters of land management, in maintaining the land's holiness, giving it rest every 7 years, paying tribute to God's priests in the form of tithes and first fruit offerings, and assuring that landed property remained within the family. All of this is justified on the grounds that the one true owner of the land is God. As the deity proclaims in Leviticus 25:23, "For the land is mine, you are but strangers resident with me." Earlier sources of the Bible conceive of the land in terms of a place of promise, in the manner of a land grant given by a king. The Holiness Code conceives of it as a divine estate, in the manner of the great temple land of the ancient Near East. Documentary evidence from the region of Bir Ili in Babylonia demonstrates that descendants of deportees from Gezer in the Judean lowlands lived near estates of the Ababar temple. The Holiness Code's rhetoric of divine ownership over the land suits ancient Near Eastern theology. According to that theology, land, soil fertility, and rainfall are determined by decisions of the deity. When gods like Asher, Marduk, or Yahweh choose a people to support, allocate them land, call the war machine into action, and establish the collection of tribute for a temple, religious structures associated with the control of natural resources become paramount in political structures as well. Nevertheless, the Holiness Code's rhetoric of divine ownership should not obscure the fact that God and his cult owned and managed individual plots of land in the countryside. An addendum to the Holiness Code, Leviticus 27, regulates a system whereby persons could consecrate real estate, animals, or silver to God. As part of the dedication process for land, a priest would appraise its value, and the dedicant would retain the right to redeem the property from God at its appraisal value with a redemption fee. Commentators have universally understood the chapter to be regulating gifts to God. In short, priests issued silver usually to farmers who needed money to buy seed, hire workers to till their fields, and so forth. In exchange for the silver, the priests called for some kind of property to be consecrated to Yahweh. The transaction assimilates a sale. God lays claim to the property until loan repayment, which the biblical text refers to as redemption. The redemption comes with a 20% fee and interest payment. Temples were important sources of credit in the ancient world. Moreover, silver loans in the mid-1st millennium BCE in Babylonia and Egypt, regardless of whether they were issued from temples or not, were regularly repaid at 20% interest. Usually, signs or boundary stones noting that the real estate in question had been mortgaged by such and such deity were placed next to the property. Fines were imposed on persons who moved them. In Leviticus 27:20-21, a debtor who sells a field that is securing a loan from the deity and does not settle the debt with the proceeds of the sale risks losing title. In such a case, it becomes the priest's perpetual holding. Moving forward to the Hellenistic period, disputes regarding consecrated real estate appear in the Damascus document, a Jewish sectarian text of the mid-2nd century BCE. While the relevant section of the text is fragmentary, it seems to deal with the consecration to God of stolen or otherwise wrongfully seized property. The possible scenarios that this very early sectarian text addresses extend far beyond simple theft and involve the use of land consecration as a means of preventing a creditor from taking possession over land that had been put up as a security on a loan. The wrongful seizure, in this case, is committed by the owner and is punishable by a fine. Tanaitic sources elaborate on the phenomenon and attest that a similar kind of consecration fraud was committed against wives seeking property that had been pledged in a marriage contract. Another crime involving cultic property is a form of harem entrapment, whereby laborers under the employ of the dedicant or household dependents, such as aging parents, find themselves deprived of any financial benefit from the property due to the imposition of sacred status on it. This could be a household garden, field, orchard, or storeroom stocked with foodstuffs. In addition to these kinds of crimes, there appears to have been a concern among certain priestly authorities that earmarked gifts of real estate to God not derived from unseemly sources, however profitable. 1 Maccabees 10 focuses on the refusal of the Jewish leader Jonathan to side with the Seleucid king Demetrius. Among Demetrius's offers to Jonathan to sway him to his side is a special gift to the temple of God in the form of the revenues of the entire agricultural hinterland of Ptolemais, called Akko. This was one of the most powerful port cities in the eastern Mediterranean and a center of Greek culture. The historian who relays the tale is not only interested in stressing Jonathan's loyalty and piety in refusing such a gift, but also in underscoring the unsuitability of Ptolemais as a source of income for the Jerusalem temple. In fact, while Hellenistic kings regularly endowed local cults with large tracts of real estate, in Judea we have not one account of a royal gift of this kind having been carried out. It was only outside Judea, in the nome of Heliopolis in Lower Egypt, that there is evidence for a large land endowment set up to support a sanctuary of the cult of the God of Israel. It is recalled that the language of Leviticus 27 implies that priests privately held land. Later Jewish sources attest to the same phenomenon. Josephus, himself a priest, held farmland near Jerusalem and was compensated for it when Roman troops garrisoned there during the war. The priest Eleazar ben Harsam is said in the Talmuds to have owned 1,000 villages in the Har HaMelech area, surely an exaggeration, but one that could still retain the memory of certain priests possessing considerable holdings in land. It would seem that from the earliest days of the Second Temple period, harem dedications were offered for just that purpose. This, too, is indicated by various sources of the Pentateuch, Leviticus 27:21, Numbers 18:14, and it is commented upon in rabbinic sources. For a number of reasons, private ownership of land by priests was a necessity for most Judean priests during this period. First, over time, their period of service at the altar decreased, limited to the 3 pilgrimage festivals and, on average, 2 additional weeks a year, for a total of around 5 weeks a year. For the remaining weeks, one can assume they were back in their hometowns. Second, the Judean priesthood appears to have grown to a very large size by the breakout of the First War with Rome. Josephus has its numbers at 20,000 strong. And third, the distribution of sacred taxes to them was not necessarily always well managed or sufficient to cover their everyday expenses, leaving them to pursue self-sufficiency endeavors, farming of land among them. Priests were influential in social circles and enjoyed great respect in late Second Temple society, even if the high priesthood underwent a decline in prominence in the era. The priests of God were not only officers of the cult, but also superintendents of the law in all aspects of daily life. They were judges, bureaucrats, taxmen, and armed law enforcers, like Saul of Tarsus. Josephus gives a clear sense of the power they wielded when he calls the priests of God punishers of those who were condemned to suffer punishment. But to limit their area of activity to the temple is to do a grave injustice to their societal influence. The landscape over which they held sway was dotted with towns and urban quarters inhabited entirely by them. These priestly settlements are referred to in various sources. A significant portion of priests lived in Jericho, for example. An underground family tomb excavated at Jericho, a town near the Dead Sea, was used by 3 generations of what appears to be a priestly family. Within the tomb is preserved a rare Judean wall painting outside of a royal context. The painting consists of vine branches, bunches of black grapes, red vine leaves, and tendrils. The style is indebted to Hellenistic naturalism and reflects an embrace of the rustic. This is not the burial place of priests whose heart lay in urban religion, but in countryside religion. In conclusion, we see, in essence, 2 kinds of sacred placemaking in classical Judaism. One is structural and related to the empowered management of land. This was religion and state closely aligned in Judea of the Second Temple period. It relates to the collection of tax, the offering of credit, and the financial support of a revered religious institution. With the good doctor's description of the temple priesthood in mind, we now turn to Jesus and other gospel characters. For Jesus to become a member of the priesthood, he first had to undergo initiation into the temple's brotherhood. This initiation required a priest to administer the ritual by means of a mikvah purification ceremony. Christianity did not exist during Jesus' lifetime. Therefore, Jesus was not a Christian, nor were his followers. The baptism ritual could not have existed under that title at the time Jesus was said to have been baptized, as Christian baptism did not exist until long after Jesus' death. What had existed in Jewish culture for centuries prior to Jesus was a ritual purification ceremony called the mikvah. The primary function of this ritual was the purification of sin through ritual bathing. However, it also had other functions such as the ritual purification required for initiation of a priest into the temple priesthood. The description of Jesus' so-called baptism is in fact the description of Jesus' initiation into the priesthood. This initiation process required a priest to perform the ritual, therefore John, referred to by Christians as the Baptist, must have been himself an acting member of the temple's priesthood. This fact can be verified by several details outlined in the Gospels. First, John's father was a temple priest. This provided John the blood birthright to the temple's priesthood. Second, only a priest could legally administer the mikvah and blessings. However, John was in fact a renegade priest. This can be verified by the Gospel description of John's dress and diet that consisted of various cultural aspects rejected by temple law, to wit, "And the same John had his raiment of camel's hair, and a leathern girdle about his loins, and his meat was locusts and wild honey." The law addressed woven material, not natural animal skin. John's camel hair, leathern dress, and insects lay outside the temple's legal code, thus openly demonstrating John's rejection of temple law. We will encounter this detailed description of open rejection of temple law again in the story of the insane man at Gadara. As fish also lay outside the temple's sacrificial code, this should alert the observant as to why most of the disciples were fishermen. These men were at the bottom of the temple's socioeconomic class of citizenry. Note also that Jesus takes a coin from a fish's mouth to pay the temple tax demanded by Peter. By producing a coin from the mouth of an unclean fish, Jesus was snubbing temple law. The reason why these seemingly odd, out-of-place descriptions exist in the Gospels is because they would have imparted critical details to attentive listeners of the oral tradition. These details preserve the actual story of Jesus. We'll go deeper into those subjects in later videos. John recognized the far greater impact Jesus would have in ending the corruption that caused the suffering he was trying to mitigate with his mikvah ceremony. As the temple priests represented the direct conduit to heaven, the flowery euphemism of the heavens opening at this critical moment of Jesus' initiation into the priesthood in the story is obvious. Priests charged for administrating the mikvah, and it was no small sum as it involved the expensive purification of sin. The poor could not afford the services, so John stood in to deliver the ritual free of charge. This can be ascertained by the fact that John delivered his ablutions at Bet Anya, a small village just outside Jerusalem. The name Bet Anya means house of alms, or house of the poor. In this description, one finds John delivering this service to those who could not afford to pay a priest. Of course, one would expect to find the poor close to the larger urban population of Jerusalem. This fact becomes obvious when one looks at where current populations of poor live. While John was doing his small part to help victims of temple law, he recognized the far greater impact Jesus would have in ending the corruption that caused the suffering he was trying to mitigate with his mikvah ceremony. This can be seen in Matthew's description. Then cometh Jesus from Galilee to Jordan unto John, to be baptized of him. But John forbade him, saying, I have need to be baptized of thee, and comest thou to me? And Jesus answering said unto him, Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he suffered him. And Jesus, when he was baptized, went up straightway out of the water, and, lo, the heavens were opened unto him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, and lighting upon him. And lo, a voice from heaven, saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. As the temple priests represented the direct conduit to heaven, the flowery euphemism of the heavens opening at this critical moment of Jesus' initiation into the priesthood in the story is obvious. The initiation of a priest required a number of legal details to be fulfilled. Among these were the rigid requirements for the mikvah bathing ritual, along with a minimum of 3 priests to witness the ceremony. Again, we look to the gospel description for an understanding of what happened when John addresses multiple priests, to wit, But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? There is the question of why so many Sadducees would have been interested in Jesus taking a bath. It was because they realized something was amiss with John, a renegade priest delivering the initiation ceremony to a religious question mark like Jesus, and why he is doing so outside the traditional temple confines. It was at this point the priest began to suspect something was amiss with both Jesus and John being renegade priest among their midst. Jesus' father Joseph would have been sure to have been one of the Sadducee priests attending the initiation of his son into the priesthood. Thus it was no doubt it was Jesus' father Joseph that spoke these words, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. It is instructive to note here that, as legal spokesman for Yahweh, temple priests spoke for God. This led to their being referred to as sons of God. So what was the outcome for John's act of treason to the priesthood? Death. That leads us now into the next video, explaining how and why that happened to John and why Jesus was responsible. We divert here to mention the fact that the only place the Pharisees are mentioned is in the Gospels. There is no other reliable historical record for their existence. There is no group or class of people that claimed the title of Pharisee. Josephus quotes about the Pharisee may have been the work of Christian revisionist. In Matthew 23, where the Pharisee take the blame for the woes of the priesthood's oppression, we address why mention of the priests, called Kohanim, is glaringly excluded from this passage. First, note that only scribes and Pharisee are identified as the culprits. There is no mention of the Sadducee Kohanim. Yet, only the priests could claim to sit in Moses' seat, as that was common vernacular for those with authority over the law. Only the priesthood had the legal authority to deal with the law. Only the Sanhedrin priests could legally bind people to heavy burdens. There was no way scribes or Pharisee could impose the heavy economic tax burdens or punish offenders of temple law, as they had no power or authority to do so. The reference to scribes is actually an indirect reference to the priests that made up the ranks of the scribes. However, scribes did not dictate the law, they merely recorded the law. The description of the phylacteries and borders are references to priestly garb. While there were chief seats in the temple, they did not exist in synagogues that were communal meeting houses. Clearly, the only group that had the power, authority, and appearances detailed in this description would have been the temple priesthood. Note the following from Matthew 23 to 15 to 17, where scribes and Pharisee are identified as targets of corruption. Yet only the priests sought proselytes for their brotherhood's following. Only priests could swear by the gold of the temple, as it was the priests that were responsible for sanctifying the gold. Also, the only people with legal authority to seize property, like the houses of widows, were the temple priests. Remember, women could not own property. Therefore, absent a male representative to take ownership, a widow's property automatically defaulted to the temple. This verbal subterfuge was obviously not what Jesus would have used making his case, as the audience he was addressing would not have been gullible enough to swallow such misidentification. Everyone well knew and understood the temple priesthood's immense and deadly power. This is the way the story would have been passed down by those in fear of the priesthood. When one is aware of the treacherous nature of the temple's powerful priesthood, it becomes obvious that openly referring to the priests in a negative manner could be considered a very dangerous act of treachery. The terms scribes and Pharisee were likely substitute terms used to deflect the priesthood's deadly wrath. Note: while video and audio contain AI elements, script content is completely human-generated. There is no AI-generated script or script editing included in the narration.